Let's try a little experiment. I want you to imagine yourself standing on a beach. Maybe it's the golden sands of California or the jade-green waters of Thailand. You are looking out at the ocean, watching the rolling waves crash against the shore. Peaceful, isn't it? Eternal, isn't it? Dead wrong. Now step into the water, don't stop. Go deep down, deeper still. Keep walking straight down to the bottom of the ocean until you reach a depth of 400 feet, about 122 meters. What do you think you'll see? Coral? Shipwrecks? Or a few hungry sharks? Number. What you find there will send shivers down your spine. There, under millions of tons of salt water, are the ruins of dense forests, winding river valleys, and caves where our ancestors once built fires to keep warm. A world once teeming with life, where you could breathe fresh air, now drowned in darkness. And the scariest part? It only disappeared yesterday in geological history, a mere 12,000 years ago. Welcome to Dark History. I am Zorro, and today we are going to dive into the grave of a lost world. Open up Google Maps. You look at it and think, this is Earth. This is the truth. America is here. Canada is over there. The ocean separates everything. We arrogantly believe that this map is immutable. But if I handed you a map from 12,000 years ago, you would think I mistakenly gave you a map of a different planet. At that time, the sea level was 400 feet lower than it is now. Let me help you visualize that. That is the height of a 40-story building. A 40-story building, completely dry, now drowned underwater. Look at Southeast Asia. Indonesia wasn't a scattered chain of islands like it is now. It was a massive subcontinent called Sundaland, a great landmass connecting Sumatra, Java, and Borneo to the Asian mainland. Look over at Europe. England? It wasn't the foggy island nation. Back then, you could leisurely walk from London to Paris, make a croissant, and walk back without getting a single big toe wet. The cold North Sea of today was once Doggerland, a lush green paradise with forests and valleys. The Persian Gulf didn't exist. It was just a fertile river valley where humans hunted, built villages, fell in love, and slaughtered each other. All of them, all those early civilizations, are now just mud at the bottom of the sea. It didn't happen slowly over millions of years like those sleepy geography lectures at school. It happened fast, brutally fast. The seawater rose like a ravenous monster, swallowing land, villages, and memories. And here is where the story gets interesting. In a creepy way, almost every ancient civilization on Earth, despite being separated by thousands of miles with no internet, no telephones, whispers the same fearful story. The Mesopotamians had the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Jews had Noah. Greece had Deucalion. China, India, Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians. They all tell of a doomsday when the sky collapsed and the waters rose to drown the world. Modern historians often smirk. Oh, that's just mythology, a metaphor for the wrath of the gods. But geologists aren't laughing. They are sweating bullets. Because when they read the rocks tell the exact same story. A great deluge was real. A sudden climate change event wiped out giant beasts, forcing humans to flee to high ground or drown. But before we find out what caused it, we have to understand what the world looked like before it collapsed. Let's turn the clock back 20,000 years. The last glacial maximum. If you are imagining a cold winter like in Hanoi or Chicago, forget it. You are fatally mistaken. It was a different planet, a planet of ice. North America wasn't the land of the free. It was the land of frost. A massive ice sheet called the Laurentide, more than 3 kilometers thick, crushed everything. Imagine stacking 7 Empire State Buildings on top of each other, and you still haven't reached the top of the ice burying New York. Its weight was so terrible, it caused the Earth's crust to concave like a thumb pressing into soft clay. Europe was the same. Want to visit London back then? Good luck. Bring a subterranean drill because you'd have to dig through kilometers of ice to see the ground. But that cold brought a strange stability, and in that stability, monsters rose. You think lions today are scary? That's cute. Back then we had giant ground sloths weighing 3 tons, as big as elephants but much more muscular. We had glyptodon, beasts like armadillos but the size of a Volkswagen Beetle with a spiked tail that could smash the skull of anyone who got close. Saber-toothed tigers, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses. They weren't rare creatures in cartoons. They ruled this world. And humans? We weren't weaklings shivering in caves like textbooks often draw. Not at all. Our ancestors were certified badasses. They were survival masters. They hunted mammoths with stone spears. They sewed clothes that withstood temperatures of -40 degrees. They built complex communities right on the coastlines that are now underwater. They lived prosperously, strongly, and intelligently. But there was one thing they didn't know. One thing that even the most skilled hunters couldn't see. They were living on a ticking time bomb. All that ice, billions upon billions of tons of water locked up on the continents. It didn't stay still. As the ice moved, it acted like giant bulldozers, creating massive natural dams. And behind those fragile ice dams were gigantic freshwater lakes, inland seas accumulated from melting ice water. Lake Agassiz. Remember this name. A lake larger than all the current Great Lakes combined. A giant water bomb perched precariously on North America, held back only by walls of ice. Humans downstream were still hunting, still dancing, still telling stories by the fire, completely unaware that in the far north, the pin of the grenade was about to be pulled. And when it was pulled, hell wouldn't open up from the ground. It would crash down from the north. Let's go back to about 14,000 years ago. Everything is going great. Really, the Earth starts to warm up. Those massive ice sheets we just talked about in the last part begin to retreat politely. Forests spread, birds sing, and our ancestors probably thought, great, that damn ice age is over. Time to enjoy life. But Mother Nature, oh, she has a very dark sense of humor. She loves those last-minute plot twists. Just as the world was preparing for an eternal spring, boom! About 12,800 years ago, something happened. A giant ashtray smacked into the face of this planet. In less than a decade, listen closely, within just one human lifetime, Earth was thrown back into the freezer. Temperatures free fell. The world froze over again with an intensity no less severe than the peak of the Ice Age. Scientists call this period by a name that sounds poetic, but is actually a nightmare. Younger Dryas, named after a tiny wildflower that only likes to grow in cold, barren places. But here is the paradox that will give you a headache. How could the world be frozen and drowned at the same time? Remember those water bombs I mentioned in the last part? Those giant lakes like Lake Agassiz held back by walls of ice? When the climate started fluctuating wildly, the safety mechanisms of these bombs failed. The ice dams burst. Visualize this scene. This isn't a tiny hydroelectric dam in your suburbs springing a leak. We are talking about a wall of fresh water hundreds of meters high, containing trillions of cubic meters of water, released in an instant. You want proof? Go to the Scablands in Washington State, USA. When you stand on the ground, it just looks like strange rolling hills. But when you fly up high, looking down from a plane, you will see the horrifying truth. Those aren't hills. Those are ripples on a riverbed, just like the tiny sand ripples you see on the beach when the waves recede. The only difference is, these sand ripples are as high as a 3-story building, and the distance between them is hundreds of meters. To create giant ripples like that on solid rock, you need a water flow hundreds of meters deep, moving at the speed of an F1 race car. It tore open the ground, stripped away the basalt crust, carried ice boulders the size of aircraft carriers, and crushed everything in its path. It wasn't a river. It was God's giant liquid grinder. And where did the water go? Naturally, it poured into the ocean. This is where the global nightmare began. We often hear about climate change and sea levels rising a few millimeters a year. That is worrying, sure. But what happened 12,000 years ago wasn't a few millimeters. It was meltwater pulses. Imagine you are living in Doggerland, the land connecting England and Europe. You are living in a lush green valley. One morning, you hear a roar. Not thunder. It's deeper, shaking the very ground beneath your feet. You look toward the horizon and see a white line rushing towards you. The seawater isn't rising slowly. It is crashing in. Low-lying coastal areas, home to the most populous early civilizations, were wiped out not in a few centuries, but possibly in just a few weeks, or even days during the peak surges. Indonesia, Sundaland, was torn apart into islands. The land bridge connecting Asia and America, Beringia, sank to the bottom of the sea, cutting off the way home for those who had migrated. The survivors? They became the first refugees in human history. Try to put yourself in their shoes. You don't know about geology. You don't know about glacial lakes or climate. All you know is the world is ending. The gods are angry. The water is swallowing everything. You run to higher ground, but the water keeps chasing you. Your grandmother's village? Gone. The forest where you hunted? Disappeared. Your entire world shrinks to a small island, then a mountain peak. This event didn't just redraw the map. It wiped our memory clean. Think about this seriously. Where do humans usually build things? On the coast, at river mouths. If sea levels rose 120 meters instantly today, what would disappear? New York, Tokyo, London, Shanghai, Saigon. All our greatest centers of economy, culture, and knowledge would be at the bottom of the sea. The survivors running up the mountains, what could they bring? A few clothes, maybe a laptop with a dead battery. 1,000 years later, their descendants would tell stories about skyscrapers and iron birds flying in the sky. And the kids would laugh and say, that's a fairy tale. That is exactly what happened to us. We find megalithic structures at the bottom of the sea in Japan, Yonaguni. We see cities submerged at the bottom of the Mediterranean. We see ruins in India, Dwarka, that were previously considered myths until divers found massive stone walls. Human history isn't a straight line going up from cavemen to iPhone users. It is a bumpy road with catastrophic fractures. We are a species with collective amnesia, forgetting how brilliantly developed we once were before the water crashed in. But the biggest question, the question that has made scientists argue until they turn purple in conferences for the past 20 years, isn't, did it happen? The evidence is too clear. The question is, what the hell triggered it? Why did a warming Earth suddenly freeze? Why did 3-kilometer-thick ice sheets melt fast enough to tear apart the Earth's crust? A natural climate shift? Or an external agent? An uninvited guest from the cosmos? To melt this ice cube, I just need my body heat. Piece of cake. But to melt an ice sheet 3 kilometers thick, covering millions of square miles, in a time frame so short it's absurd, you need a little more than summer warmth. You need energy. A massive, violent, and instantaneous amount of energy. Mainstream scientists, for decades, tried to convince us that the Earth changes slowly, that everything happens smoothly, like a boring symphony. But recent geological data is screaming a different truth in their faces. Earth doesn't change with patience. It changes with punches. And about 12,800 years ago, it seems the sky threw a knockout punch at this planet. Let's look at the most controversial yet most terrifying hypothesis, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Imagine a massive comet, maybe up to 100 kilometers in diameter. It doesn't slam straight into us like a single bullet. That would be too quick and clean. It starts to disintegrate as it nears the sun. It turns into a giant cosmic shotgun. Thousands of fiery fragments plunge into the Earth's atmosphere. Some pieces fall into the ocean, creating tsunamis hundreds of meters high. Some fall on land, triggering continent-scale wildfires. But the most dangerous pieces, they fall directly onto the Laurentide ice sheet in North America. Picture a fiery meteorite slamming into 3-kilometer thick ice at 60,000 kilometers per hour. It isn't just a collision, it is the instant conversion of kinetic energy into thermal energy. Boom! Millions of tons of ice don't melt slowly. They vaporize. They explode. They create supersonic floods instantly. This is the mechanism that triggered the waters that tore apart the scablands we saw. The water didn't flow. The water exploded from the glaciers. You think I'm making up a Hollywood movie script? Let me introduce you to the forensic evidence. Detectives call it the killer's fingerprints. Geologists call it the black mat. Across North America, Europe, and even parts of South America, scientists found a thin layer of sediment, black in color, dated precisely to around 12,800 years ago. Below that black layer, the bones of mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, giant ground sloths, and the stone tools of the Clovis culture. Above that black layer, nothing. Empty. Life disappeared. But what lies inside that black mat is what makes you shudder. They found nanodiamonds. Diamonds don't form from rain showers. They need extreme pressure and heat, the kind of pressure found only deep within the Earth, or when an extraterrestrial object collides with Earth with the power of thousands of nuclear bombs. They found iridium. They found the ash of wildfires that burned 10% of the Earth's biomass at the time. The picture emerges too clearly, a rain of bombs from the cosmos. Fire scorching the forests, ice melting causing a great deluge, and then ash blocking the sun, pushing Earth into the frigid Younger Dryas ice age for another 1,200 years before warming up again. That was the 1-2 punch of creation. First fire, then ice, and in between was water. And now, let's go back to the myths we mentioned in the previous part. Recall Plato and the story of Atlantis. He didn't just talk about a city sinking into the sea. He spoke of a night of terrible earthquakes and floods. Reread the Bible not as religion, but as a record log. Before Noah's great flood, there were descriptions of fire falling from the sky. Listen to the legends of the Ojibwe people in North America telling of the long-tailed star that fell and scorched the world, followed by water rising to drown everything. We, arrogant modern humans, have laughed at our ancestors for being superstitious. We think they wove tales of fire-breathing dragons and angry gods, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were trying to warn us. They didn't have scientific words like asteroid or thermal shockwave. They used their language, dragons, gods, demons, but the core memory is the truth. A global catastrophe happened. It wiped out civilizations more advanced than we think, the people who built megalithic structures that we still don't understand how they made today. It pushed humanity back to the Stone Age. The survivors huddling in caves or on high mountain peaks lost everything. Technology, knowledge, history, washed out to sea. They had only one thing left to pass down to their descendants: stories, cautionary tales that the sky could fall at any moment. So we have the motive, cosmic cycle. We have the killer, comet/asteroid. And we have the victim, a brilliant Ice Age world. But this story isn't just about the past. If you think this is just a history lesson, you are sorely mistaken. Why? Because the ice sheets are still there, Antarctica, Greenland. The sea level is still waiting to pounce, and the universe is still a giant shooting range. We, humanity of the 21st century, with all our iPhones and satellites, are we any different from the Atlanteans or the residents of Sundaland back then? We are building our greatest cities right on the water's edge, exactly as they did. We are living in a brief period of peace between catastrophes. And the question isn't, will it happen again? The question is, when it happens, what story will we tell the survivors of the future? Or will we again become a vague myth about a golden age that was submerged? The world didn't end in 2012. It didn't end in 2000 either, but it did end around 12,000 years ago. And here is the brutal truth that no one wants to admit. We, the humans sitting here scrolling through phones in air-conditioned rooms, are not the conquerors of Earth. We are the survivors. Or more accurately, we are the descendants of the lucky ones who didn't drown, weren't crushed by ice, and weren't incinerated by fire from the sky. After the Great Deluge, after the water receded partially and the sky cleared, the living stepped out of the caves. What did they see? The Garden of Eden was lost. The rich coastal hunting grounds? Drowned. The herds of giant beasts that provided meat for the whole tribe? Extinct. They faced a new reality: hunger, cold, and loneliness. Mainstream historians often tell us that agriculture was a genius invention, that humans suddenly got smart and decided, hey, instead of hunting for fun, let's toil in the fields from dawn till dusk. Does that sound reasonable? Not at all. Agriculture was not a choice. It was an act of desperation. After the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the natural ecosystem collapsed. Humans were forced to force the land to produce food so as not to starve. The civilization we know, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus, was not a glorious beginning. It was an effort to reboot society from the ashes. Look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It was built right after the Ice Age ended, about 11,600 years ago. Stone pillars weighing tens of tons, intricately carved, arranged astronomically. Who built it? Hunter-gatherers? Impossible. To do that, you need organization. You need mathematical knowledge. You need engineering. It is like a message, a stone library that the survivors left behind, trying to preserve the last knowledge of a lost era before the darkness of oblivion took over. And then, true oblivion arrived. Graham Hancock calls us a species with amnesia. Imagine you are in a serious car accident. You wake up in the hospital, not remembering who you are, not remembering the past. You only see scars on your body. That is humanity today. We forgot who we used to be. We forgot the brilliant coastal cities that were submerged. We forgot how deeply connected we once were with nature and the cosmos. All that remains are interrupted dreams in the form of myths. The story of Noah, of Atlantis, of fire-breathing dragons. Those aren't fairy tales for children. They are collective PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares of humanity, passed down orally through thousands of generations. A whispered warning. Careful, the water can rise again. The sky can fall again. But we, the arrogant children of the technological age, have plugged our ears. We build nuclear power plants right on the coast. We build mega cities on geological fault lines. We live as if tomorrow is always guaranteed. The irony of history is this: the more complex a civilization, the more fragile it is. Our Ice Age ancestors could survive when the power went out, the internet went down, the supermarkets vanished. They knew how to read the sky, knew how to find water, knew how to endure. And us? If an event like the Younger Dryas happened tomorrow, a solar storm, a meteorite, or a sudden melting of ice, what would become of us? Look down below. No, this isn't Mars, nor is it the set of some B-grade sci-fi movie about the end of the Earth. This is America, or more precisely, this is the scene of a colossal murder. Welcome to the Scablands. If you fly over Washington State today, you will see giant gashes tearing through the Earth's crust. There are trenches deeper than 900 feet, nearly 300 meters, and up to 50 miles wide. Just imagine, what possesses enough power to take a knife and carve wounds that deep into basalt rock as hard as steel? Wind, rain, or millions of years of patient erosion like the lullabies your textbooks taught you? No. Don't be so naive. Nature isn't always a benevolent mother. Sometimes she is a brutal killer. Let's talk about J. Harlan Bretz. In the 1920s, he was an outcast, the bastard child of geology. Bretz looked at these scars, lonely rock islands amidst dry valleys, giant ripples hundreds of feet high imprinted on the ground, and he saw something no one else dared to see: a cataclysmic flood. But here was the problem. At that time, the scientific community worshipped a religion called uniformitarianism. The name alone makes you sleepy, doesn't it? They believed that everything changes slowly, gradually, over millions of peaceful years. To them, the Earth was a polite gentleman who never lost his temper. As for catastrophism, oh, that was heresy reserved for the superstitious. They mocked Bretz. They considered him a madman. How could water slice through mountain rock in just a few days? But Bretz was right. And that sanctimonious crowd was dead wrong. The Scablands weren't created over millions of years. They were torn apart in mere days, maybe even hours. The scene shows current Niagara Falls, majestic and loud. Then the image shrinks, placed next to a simulation of the ancient dry falls. Niagara suddenly looks tiny, like a garden hose. Let me show you the scale of this insanity. You know Niagara Falls, right? Majestic, magnificent, the place couples often go to take selfies. Put it next to what happened here, and Niagara looks like nothing more than a fountain in your backyard. At Dry Falls, Washington, we find the remains of a waterfall 3.5 miles wide and 400 feet high. Picture a volume of water 10 times greater than all the rivers on Earth today combined, all crashing down a single cliff face. The roar? You could have heard it from hundreds of miles away. The mist rising from that impact created eternal rainbows that, if someone were sitting on a space station looking down, would make it look like the Earth was bleeding. But the Scablands were just the prelude. The real culprit was Lake Agassiz, a monster of water imprisoned by ice. And when those ice dams broke, God, it didn't flow. It exploded. The water sought an escape. It tore through everything in its path. Some surged south, crushing the Mississippi Valley. Others exploded toward the northeast. Every wave was a reset button for any civilization unlucky enough to stand in its way. And yes, there were people there. The Paleo-Indians. They were here. Small, brave groups, hunting mammoths and giant bison. They lived by the rivers, drinking from streams they thought were gentle. They didn't know they were camping inside the barrel of a giant water gun that was already loaded. Do you think they had a chance? Maybe they heard a distant rumble, like thunder, but never ending, the roar of approaching death. Then they saw the river levels rise, not rising slowly like the seasons. It rose irrationally, insanely, surpassing every historical floodmark their ancestors had ever told them about. And then, boom, end of movie. The wall of water hit. No goodbyes, no last wills. Entire tribes, campsites, history, culture, wiped out, crushed under millions of tons of water and mud in a split second. They didn't drown. They were erased. We don't find their bones? Of course not. How do you find an ant after it's been run over by a steamroller? But the death of those hunters was just the beginning of a much crazier domino effect. You think the floodwaters only killed people? No, they killed the climate too. They strangled the ocean. And what happened next will make you shudder at the fragility of the warm world we live in. We don't have tombstones carved with the names of the lost. We don't have written records mourning the destruction. What we have is silence, a deafening silence. And we have DNA. Look at ourselves. Geneticists call it a genetic bottleneck. That is a polite scientific way of saying almost everyone died, leaving only a few lucky survivors to maintain the species. The sudden drop in genetic diversity in Native American populations during this period is forensic proof of the scale of the massacre. But as I said, their deaths were just the first domino falling. The problem is, billions of tons of fresh water from those superfloods didn't vanish into thin air. It had to go somewhere. And its destination was the North Atlantic. You think pouring more water into the ocean isn't a big deal? Oh, you are hugely mistaken. This isn't pouring a bucket of water into a bathtub. This is injecting poison directly into the planet's circulatory system. Let me introduce you to Earth's central heating system, the North Atlantic Current, AMOC. The only reason Europe, which should be a frozen tundra given its geographic location, has a mild, pleasant climate for humans to build civilizations, is thanks to this current. It is a giant conveyor belt carrying warm, salty water from the tropics to the north. There, the water cools, becomes denser, heavier, and sinks to the sea floor, pulling the whole operating system along. It is the heartbeat of the global climate. It sustains life. And then, Lake Agassiz broke its dam. Boom! Billions of tons of fresh, freezing glacial water were suddenly pumped straight into the system. Here is a basic physics lesson. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. It doesn't sink. It floats on the surface like an oil slick. It acts like a giant lid, preventing the natural sinking process that drives circulation. The result? Cardiac arrest. The conveyor belt stopped. The heat transport system shut down. And now, welcome to the Younger Dryas period. This is Mother Nature's cruelest joke. The cause was the Earth warming up, ice melting. But the result of warming up too fast was pushing the Northern Hemisphere right back into an ice age instantly. Europe, in just a few decades, went from a place of revival to suddenly becoming a deep freezer again. Ice sheets that had just retreated began to advance. It was a brutal climate U-turn that no weather forecast model today could even imagine. And it didn't just happen in America. Across the ocean, a similar script was playing out. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covering northern Europe was also disintegrating in chaos. Ice dams in Russia and Siberia burst, sending pulses of deadly fresh water into the Arctic Ocean. The Baltic Sea basin shape-shifted constantly from a freshwater lake to a salty sea as rising ocean levels breached the straits. We are talking about geological changes that usually take tens of thousands of years to complete, now happening within a single human lifetime. Coastlines stable for millennia suddenly sank. Dry valleys turned into flooded estuaries. But the scariest thing wasn't the cold returning. the scariest thing was the deception. Geological evidence shows this wasn't a single event. It happened multiple times. Ice sheets seemed stable, then suddenly collapsed. Floods happened. Climate chaos. Then everything seemed normal again. The people of that time, those poor survivors, they had just resettled, just breathed a sigh of relief thinking the nightmare was over. They rebuilt their lives on new shores. They thought the world was safe. They were wrong. Stability was just a mirage. The destroyer was just reloading for the next shot. And this next shot, it didn't aim at the continent. It aimed at the ocean itself. Do you believe in ghosts? I don't. But I believe in ghost forests. And they are right beneath our feet, deep under the sea, whispering a truth that humanity has deliberately forgotten. Let's go back to our prime suspect, Lake Agassiz. This lake was like a schizophrenic. It drained, then filled, then drained again. Every time it had an episode, some civilization was wiped out. But the final blow, the greatest drainage event recorded in sediment cores, happened around 8,470 years ago. Remember this number. Maybe within just 1 year, perhaps even more devastating, within a single summer, Agassiz poured all its fury through Hudson Bay into the North Atlantic. 40,000 cubic miles of water. Can you visualize that? That number is too abstract. Let me convert it into apocalypse units. That amount of water was enough to raise global sea levels by more than 3 feet, about 1 meter, almost overnight. Imagine you go to sleep, listening to the waves murmuring in the distance. The next morning you wake up, and the sea is right at your doorstep. Not the tide. It doesn't recede. That is the world's new sea level. But you know me. This Zorro never speaks in vain. I need hard proof, the kind of evidence you can see with your own eyes. And the most haunting evidence isn't in textbooks. It lies at the bottom of the cold seas of the Pacific Northwest. At the bottom of Puget Sound and along the coast of British Columbia, divers found something that shouldn't exist there. Trees. And no, they aren't cold stone fossils. They are real wood. Still intact after 12,000 years thanks to preservation in these cold, oxygen-poor waters. What makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up is their posture. They are still standing upright. Roots still planted deep in the soil. Soil that is now the ocean floor. This is the scene of a murder, and these trees are the victims. They didn't die of old age. They weren't diseased. They were executed. When scientists cut into these wood samples and counted the rings, they realized a horrifying truth. These trees were growing healthily. Then, suddenly, stop. Their lives were cut off instantly in a single season, sometimes precise to the month. Why? Because they drowned. Sea levels didn't rise slowly millimeter by millimeter like the boring climate charts on TV say. They rose in pulses. Boom! A wall of salt water rushed in, submerging the treetops so fast the trees couldn't adapt, couldn't rot, only had time to die standing in that stunned posture for 12 millennia. This is the concept of a pulse, a flood pulse. Floods in this era were unstable. They came in guerrilla attacks. Each wave raised sea levels by feet, even tens of feet in a single event. Put yourself in our ancestors' shoes. You are a fisherman. You know the sea well. You know the tides rise and fall gently. You respect the sea. But you never suspected the sea was a monster that could change its size overnight. One day the tide came in and never went out again. The next day it was higher. Within a week, your coastal village sank. Within a month, your entire territory, the place where your umbilical cord was buried, where your ancestors' graves were placed, became the seabed. Your world wasn't just changed, it was erased. It became an alien planet right before your eyes. And the scariest part? It wasn't just happening in your tiny village. It was happening globally. When ice sheets collapsed, they triggered a planetary scale domino effect. Ice melted in North America. Glaciers shattered in the Andes. Antarctic ice shelves slid into the sea. And when all that water poured into the bathtub at once, the most prime real estate of prehistoric humanity was about to disappear from the map forever. You think Atlantis is just a myth? Or is it a collective memory of these drowned worlds? Hold tight to your life jacket, because in the final part, we will see what humanity lost when the ocean swallowed paradise. "400 feet, equivalent to 122 meters. That is not the height of a hill. That is the depth of the grave that buried the old world. Imagine the sea level rising higher than a 30-story building. That is exactly what happened when the Ice Age ended. A drowned world lies beneath our feet. But here's the thing no one tells you. The apocalypse didn't happen in a split second like a Hollywood movie. Oh no, it was much crueler than that. It was a slow-motion disaster, a torture that lasted thousands of years. From 15,000 to 7,000 years ago, the ocean devoured the land. If averaged out, it was only about 15 centimeters per decade. Your grandparents might not have noticed. They just saw the path to the beach get a little shorter. Must be the tide, they would say. But you and I know the truth. Sea level is a con artist. It lulls you to sleep for a few centuries, then boom, an ice dam breaks. A pulse hits. In a flash, the ocean doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. It swallows coastlines that had been stable for generations. It turns peninsulas into islands, valleys into bays. And it turns your home into an aquarium. Look at the map. It looks completely different, doesn't it? The Bering Land Bridge, the Walk of Fame connecting Asia and North America, where humans walked back and forth for thousands of years, was flooded. The door slammed shut. Migrants were separated forever. One side became Asians, the other Native Americans, separated by a wall of cold water. In Europe, the English Channel opened up, splitting Britain from the continent. That was the first and most devastating Brexit in history. In the Middle East, the Persian Gulf filled with water, turning a fertile river valley, possibly the prototype for the Garden of Eden, into a salty sea. And most terrifying, the Black Sea. When Mediterranean waters rose, they breached the Bosporus Strait with the power of hundreds of Niagaras, turning a peaceful freshwater lake into a giant sea of death. Many say that is the origin of the legend of the Great Flood and Noah's Ark. Perhaps they are right. When your world is submerged, you don't call it climate change. You call it God's punishment. But this is the most tragic part of the story. A truth that makes archaeologists lose sleep. Ask yourself, where do humans like to live? Do you like living in damp caves in the mountains or in the middle of arid deserts? No. You want to live where the land is good and birds perch. The coast. Evolution didn't create fools. Coastal areas during the Ice Age were paradise. Mild climate moderated by the ocean. Abundant food from both sea and forest. Rivers were natural highways. Harbors sheltered against storms. This wasn't wasteland. This was the prime real estate of the ancient world. The most logical archaeological evidence suggests the most sophisticated cultures, the most creative minds, the most talented engineers of humanity at that time, they all lived here. They developed maritime technology, fishing techniques, and perhaps even the first cities. And it was all wiped out. When the sea level rose 400 feet, it didn't just take the land. It took the heart of human civilization. What we find today, stone tools in caves, broken pottery on high mountains, those are just the remnants of people living in the remote hinterlands. We are judging an entire civilization based on what was left behind in the impoverished suburbs, while the most magnificent metropolises, the most brilliant cultural centers, lie silent at the bottom of the ocean, covered by hundreds of meters of mud and water. We keep busy looking for Atlantis as a legendary golden city, but the truth is far scarier. There were thousands of real Atlantises that once existed. Have you ever stood before Niagara Falls? Its rumble makes your chest vibrate. Now multiply that by 200 times. The roar of the water pouring into the Black Sea was so terrible, you could hear it from hundreds of miles away. It wasn't the sound of flowing water. It was the roar of the sky collapsing. The spray shot up so high, it created eternal rainbows under the daylight sun, and a ghostly damp mist covering the entire region at night. The air was thick with steam and salt. The Black Sea basin filled at a frantic speed. The water level rose 6 inches, about 15 centimeters, every single day. Sounds small, doesn't it? Oh, Zorro, 15 centimeters is only up to the ankles. Don't be so naive. This is the deadly trap of complacency. On flat lakeshore plains, a vertical rise of 15 centimeters means the water line encroaches hundreds of meters, or even kilometers, deep into the mainland every day. Try to put yourself in their shoes. You go to sleep in your warm wooden cabin, the sound of waves murmuring far away on the horizon. You wake up the next morning, and the water is licking at your doorstep. Your garden is gone. The path leading to the forest has submerged. This isn't a flood that rises and then recedes after a few days. No, this is a permanent invasion. You panic, pack your belongings, drag your wife and children up the high hill. You look back at your beloved village. The next day, your roof is gone. The day after that, even the tallest tree in the village is nowhere to be seen. Forests drown, leaves limp in the salty water. Fertile river valleys become deep bays. In less than a year, the entire ecosystem changed. Imagine the chaos beneath the surface. The Black Sea shifted from fresh water to salt water. Every living thing in the lake, fish, algae, aquatic plants, died. They died en masse. Their bodies rotted, creating a toxic layer of hydrogen sulfide, H2S, at the bottom of the sea, turning the Black Sea into a giant tomb, preserving everything that fell into it. And the people, tens of thousands, had to flee. They ran from the water monster swallowing their world. What did they carry? Possessions? No, they carried terror. They carried the memory of a day when the sky screamed and the ocean swallowed the earth. Researchers believe this catastrophic event is the origin of the story of Noah in the Bible, or the epic of Gilgamesh of the Sumerians. The timing matches. The scale matches. And human psychology always seeks to explain tragedies beyond imagination through divine intervention. But here is the bitterest irony. The Black Sea wasn't the only victim. It was just the first domino to fall in a chain of global catastrophes. While people around the Black Sea were fleeing the raging torrents, on the other side of Europe, another giant nation was also preparing to be wiped off the map. A place that today you only know through fishing nets full of bones. Welcome to the true Atlantis of Europe, Doggerland. Look here. The North Sea, cold, gray, and full of oil rigs. If you want to go from London to Denmark today, you have to buy a plane ticket or endure a seasick-inducing ferry ride. But in the Ice Age, you could walk. No, I'm not joking. You could pack a backpack and walk straight from Yorkshire to Copenhagen without even getting your pant cuffs wet. That was Doggerland. This wasn't a narrow, shriveled land bridge like you imagine. This was an entire nation. A vast green plain, comparable in size to modern-day Great Britain. Imagine rolling hills, winding river valleys, mysterious peat bogs, and dense forests teeming with game. Today, it is the sea floor. But back then, it was the heart of Europe. How do we know this? Not thanks to fortune tellers, but thanks to the greatest scavengers in history, fishermen. For hundreds of years, fishing boats operating in the North Sea have pulled strange things up from the bottom. They expected cod, but their nets were heavy with other things: sharp flint tools, exquisite bone harpoons, and the remains of extinct megafauna beasts, mammoth teeth, woolly rhinoceros skulls. Every bone, every stone dredged up from that depth of 120 feet, about 36 meters, of freezing water is a silent witness. Look closely at this. This isn't trash. This is a frozen moment in time. A hunter sat by the riverbank, meticulously carving this spear point to feed his family. A woman used bone tools to tan hides, preparing for winter. A child once ran and laughed on the grass, right where it is now, the dark ocean floor. Doggerland didn't die instantly like a bullet to the head. Oh no, its death was much more painful and lingering. It died a slow death, wasting away like a terminal cancer patient. Generation after generation, they watched their world shrink. First, low-lying areas turned into stinking swamps as the water table rose. Swamps turned into brackish lagoons. Lagoons were invaded by the sea to become bays. Mighty rivers that once flowed east to join the Rhine now became salty estuaries. High ground became islands. Islands became shoals. And then the shoals vanished under the white-capped waves. But nature, with its cruel sense of humor, decided that a slow death wasn't enough. It needed a dramatic full stop, a fatality finishing move. Time: about 8,200 years ago. Location: off the coast of Norway. The Earth was recovering after shedding the burden of billions of tons of ice. The crust rebounded, shuddered, and caused an earthquake. The result was the underwater Storegga slide. Let me describe the scale for you to visualize. About 3,300 cubic kilometers of seabed sediment suddenly collapsed into the abyss. A massive chunk of the continental shelf slid away. And when that much earth and rock moves underwater, the water has to go somewhere. It created a monster tsunami. This wave wasn't like the waves you surf in Bali. It was up to 80 feet, nearly 25 meters high in some areas. A giant wall of water rushing at the speed of a jet plane, sweeping straight across the North Atlantic and slamming into what remained of Doggerland. Imagine the last communities clinging to the tiny islands left of Doggerland. They had survived rising sea levels. They had adapted. They were the most resilient. But on that fateful day, they looked at the horizon and saw death rushing towards them. Nowhere to run, no high ground to hide. The Storegga tsunami swept through and the archaeological record stops, simply snuffed out. Anyone who survived on those islands was wiped out. The settlements, the tools, the stories, the songs, all crushed under the weight of billions of tons of water and buried under cold mud. Within a few centuries after that, the last high points also sank. Britain officially became an island, isolated from the continent. The English Channel, once a poetic river valley, now became a natural defensive moat separating England and France. An entire nation disappeared. An entire civilization erased. No tombstones. No history books recording it. Only a few bone fragments and stone scraps that we accidentally scooped up remain. That was Doggerland. A cold reminder that the world map isn't drawn in permanent ink. It is drawn in sand, and the tide is always waiting to wipe it clean. But if you think this tragedy only happened in Europe, you are sorely mistaken. On the other side of the hemisphere, a tropical paradise even larger and richer was also preparing to face the ocean's death sentence, a place that once connected the Spice Islands into a supercontinent. Brace yourself, because we are about to go to Southeast Asia. We just left the deep freezer of Northern Europe. Now let's go somewhere hotter, wetter, and more mysterious. Let's spin the globe to Southeast Asia. Today, when looking at a map of this region, what do you see? A mess of large and small islands, fragmented peninsulas, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, separated by the sea. But let's rewind time. Welcome to Sundaland. During the Ice Age, the Sundacontinental Shelf wasn't a sea. It was a supercontinent. It connected Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Indochina Peninsula into one massive landmass. Its area, about 1.8 million square kilometers. Let me put that in context for you. It was bigger than the state of Alaska in the US. A landmass that huge disappeared completely. And this wasn't a barren wasteland. Oh no. Think of it as the Amazon of the ancient world, but better. Rich tropical coastlines, vibrant coral reefs, vast mangrove forests, and the most fertile river deltas on the planet. Biodiversity here reached its peak. If you were a human back then, where would you want to live? In the bone-chilling cold of Europe or this tropical paradise? Exactly. Researchers believe that the inhabitants of Sundaland weren't savages who only knew how to wield sticks to chase wild animals. Living by such a rich coast, they likely developed sophisticated maritime cultures 1,000 years ahead of their time. Boats? Yes. Fishing technology? Definitely. Trade networks connecting islands? Very likely. But then the water rose. Here, the disaster didn't happen as a single tsunami. It was like a cruel sentence of separation. As sea levels gradually licked into the mainland, Sundaland was torn apart. First, it broke into large islands. Then, those islands were further divided. Communities that used to walk to each other's houses were now separated by ever-widening straits. Imagine the culture shock. You were once part of a vast trading empire on land, and suddenly you became an islander, isolated, cut off from the world. By about 10,000 years ago, the shape of modern Southeast Asia was defined. The primitive city centers, the cultural cradles of Sundaland, are now lying silent under hundreds of meters of tropical seawater. We haven't even begun to search for them. But the craziest story doesn't lie in what we find, but in what we remember. Look a little to the south. Australia. During the Ice Age, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were a single unit called Sahul. You could walk from Papua New Guinea all the way down to the southern tip of Tasmania. Then the sea came. It created the Torres Strait and Bass Strait, severing these lands forever. And this is where things get hair-raising. Australian Aborigines have oral traditions. These stories tell of a time when the islands were still connected, of coastlines that were swallowed by water. You might laugh and say, Zorro, those are just fairy tales. But think again. Geologists confirm those flooding events happened 10,000 years ago. That means this memory has been passed down through 400 generations. 400 generations. Do you remember your great-great-grandfather's name? Probably not. Yet these people preserved precise geographical information over 10 millennia without missing a beat. No writing, no hard drives, just speech and memory. This proves a terrifying truth. These aren't entertainment stories told by the fire. This is a survival manual. They pass down true horror to their descendants. The sea can rise, the land can disappear. Never underestimate the ocean. These were warnings encoded into culture to ensure the next generation didn't drown like the one before. But every adaptation has a price. Some stayed on the coast and drowned. Some ran inland and had to fight to seize territory. And elsewhere, In a place considered the cradle of human civilization, the rising sea didn't just create refugees. It created kings. It created the first legends written down in clay. Welcome to the Persian Gulf. Today, this is the playground of oil tycoons and super yachts. But look down beneath that sand and salt water. During the Ice Age, the Persian Gulf didn't exist. It was a giant river valley, an extension of the Tigris and Euphrates river system. It was fertile, green, nourished by water from the Zagros Mountains. Archaeologists suspect this was the true Garden of Eden, where humans first learned to domesticate animals and farm. But the terrain here is flat. And as I said, water hates flat places. When the sea rose, it didn't knock to ask for permission. It flooded in, relatively fast. Within a few millennia, this entire cradle of early civilization turned into a shallow sea. So where did the people living there go? They didn't sprout fins to swim. They ran. They were pushed back to the north and west, herded into the land we call Mesopotamia. And boom! Suddenly, we see the rise of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. Let me propose a crazy but plausible theory. Was the first brilliant human civilization built by climate refugees? They were people who lost their country. They carried pain, but they also carried advanced knowledge of agriculture, architecture, and social organization from their lost homeland. They built great cities not because they had free time, but because they needed order in a chaotic world. And it is no surprise that Sumerian mythology, the oldest written texts in history, opens with the story of a great flood that destroyed the world before kings were lowered from heaven. But what haunts me most isn't the birth of cities. It is the psychological horror of the so-called slow disaster. Imagine you are a father in that era. You drive a rock into the shore to mark the tide level. When you are 10 years old, the water is at the base of the rock. When you are 30 years old, the rock has submerged. Your grandfather tells of that island out there that used to be a hill connected to the mainland. It is mental torture. You know it's coming. It's slow enough for you to hope maybe it will stop, but fast enough for you to know for certain that your children and grandchildren will have no place to stay. You face an impossible choice. One is to stay, adapt, build stilt houses, and eventually drown along with your ancestors' tombs. Two is to abandon everything, migrate inland, where land is scarce and people are crowded, where those who arrived first are ready to kill you to defend their territory. Millions had to choose. Bloody migrations, painful integrations, cultures wiped out or swallowed by stronger ones, and nature occasionally sped up to remind everyone who was boss. The meltwater pulses. Meltwater Pulse 1A, 14,600 years ago. Sea levels rose 50 feet, 15 meters, in less than 500 years. That is a speed of destruction visible to the naked eye within a single human lifetime. By about 7,000 years ago, the nightmare paused. Sea levels stabilized. The old world had drowned. The fertile continental shelves disappeared, but the descendants of the survivors remained. They sat around the fire, shivering as they told each other about the old world, about fertile lands punished by the gods with water. And here is the punchline that will make you shudder. There are over 200 different cultures across this planet, from the Maya in Central America, the Australian Aborigines, the Sumerians in the Middle East, to tribes in India and China, all sharing one common story: a great flood, a world swallowed up, a small group of survivors. Montage of different artistic depictions of the flood from various cultures. They were separated by oceans, mountains, languages. They didn't have the internet to copy-paste each other's ideas. So why are the stories so similar? because it isn't a coincidence, nor is it vivid imagination. It is memory. It is the collective scar of humanity. A psychological trauma so deep that it has been encoded into our religion, mythology, and culture for the last 10,000 years. We are the descendants of those who escaped. We are living on the mountain peaks of a world that drowned. Next, let's start where everything began. Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq. If you think the story of the Great Flood starts with the Bible, sorry, you arrived a few thousand years late. Let me introduce the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was carved into clay about 4,000 years ago, but the Sumerians had been telling it for 5,000 years before that. In this story, we have a guy named Utnapishtim. Basically, he is the limited edition Noah of Mesopotamia. The gods of that time decided to destroy humanity. The reason? Because humans were too numerous and too noisy. Sounds reasonable, right? Just like a cranky neighbor wanting to spray ant poison because they are disturbing his afternoon nap. But there was one god, Ea, who played dirty. He tipped off Utnapishtim, tear down your house, build a boat immediately, seal it with bitumen, stuff your family, craftsmen, and animals inside. Sound familiar? It has to be familiar, because this is the original script for Noah's Ark. But this version is interesting because it is extremely geographically specific. It points exactly to the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And guess what? That is exactly the place that would turn into a giant swimming pool when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. It wasn't a slow rise like the tide. It was tsunamis, walls of water suddenly crashing into the river valley. For the poor farmers there, the world wasn't just flooding. The world was drowning. Then we come to the Hollywood blockbuster version everyone knows. Noah. Skip the theology, skip the judgment of God, or the covenant rainbow. Look at the technical data. Rain for 40 days and nights. Water rising for 150 days. Mountain peaks were the only things left. And most importantly, the olive branch. Why an olive branch? That is a sign of vegetation returning. If you were a detective investigating a crime scene, this is a chillingly accurate description of rapid sea level rise. Ancient people didn't know about glaciers or melting ice sheets. They just saw water falling from the sky like a waterfall. To them, it was punishment. But to us, it is a weather report from hell. But this is where things get suspicious. If only the Middle East talked about floods, I would say it was a local affair. But no, jump to India. We have Manu, a small fish. Actually, the god Vishnu, a classic plot twist, warns him about a deluge. Manu builds a boat, ties it to the fish's horn, and is towed to a mountain peak. Fly to China. We have the legend of Gun and Yu. While the West built boats to flee, what did the Chinese do? They built dams. I love this mindset. Flood, huh? Let me dig a canal to guide you somewhere else. The story of Emperor Yu the Great controlling the waters isn't just a myth. It is a memory of how our ancestors used engineering to fight nature after the Ice Age in the Yellow River Valley. Then to Greece with Deucalion and the wooden chest, to North America with the Ojibwe and the trickster hero Wisakedjak, down to South America with the Aztecs and Mayans, up to the high Andes or into the Amazon caves. The pattern repeats to the point of obsession, sudden rising water. Not a spring flood, high mountains as the only refuge. Boats are life. And most importantly, there is a before and an after. The old world was completely wiped out. Are you still skeptical? Do you think oral tradition is just a game of telephone? Look at Australia. The Aborigines there have songs that describe exact coastlines and islands that haven't existed for over 10,000 years. Geologists checked and boom, accurate to the meter. If they can remember geography from 10,000 years ago, why can't the rest of humanity remember the day the whole world was drowned in water? The mechanism is very simple. Encode information into a story. Repeat it in sacred rituals. Forbid changing even a single word. Turn it into religion. That is the only way to send a warning message to the future when you haven't invented writing or hard drives. When you layer these 200 mythological stories onto a geological map, they fit together like pieces of a bloody crime scene puzzle. Mesopotamian floods match the flooding of the Persian Gulf. Greek floods match the Black Sea tragedy of a natural dam bursting 7,500 years ago. American floods match the melting ice along the Pacific coast. When 200 independent witnesses who don't know each other at all testify against one suspect, you don't have the right to dismiss them. You have to investigate. They witnessed the end of the Ice Age, the period from 15,000 to 11,000 years ago. Glaciers melted, ice dams collapsed, and sea levels rose to swallow everything. To them, it was the apocalypse, and they were right. The world they knew died, but they lived. They told the story. And we, the children of those survivors, are still telling that story every time we see too much rainfall. We have the witness testimony, but in a planetary scale murder case, testimony isn't enough. We need the body. We need the murder weapon. Let's turn the clock back a bit. Before the walls of ice crumbled, humans lived a life that was honestly pretty chill for tens of thousands of years. Imagine you are one of them. You belong to a small group, about 20 or 30 people. No boss, no deadlines, no bank debt. You are a nomad. You follow the herds, gathering plants by season. The world is a giant buffet, and you move constantly to enjoy it. We had sophisticated tools, complex language, and hunting tactics that could take down beasts as big as a bus. But most importantly, we were free. When food ran out, move. When you hated your neighbor, move somewhere else. The world back then was endlessly vast, and borders were a ridiculous concept that had never existed. But then, the water came. Not the Hollywood-style tsunami washing everything away in a split second. It was much crueler than that. It was slow, sullen, but never stopping. Year after year, decade after decade, the ocean opened its giant mouth and swallowed the old world. The rich coastlines, which used to be our ancestors' resort paradise with abundant seafood and mild climates, were the first places to be wiped out. Green valleys gradually sank into the darkness of the ocean. And what did humans do? We did what we do best. Run. But this time, run where? This is where the irony of fate begins. The giant beasts, megafauna, the massive mobile protein sources sustaining us, were dying out, partly because the climate changed too fast, causing them heat shock. The rest, because of us. Imagine this scene. A landmass shrinking due to rising seas, and a crowd of hungry, panicked humans fighting over the last woolly mammoths. We hunted them to extinction not because we were cruel, but because we were starving on a sinking ship. The nomadic life of wandering after herds on the vast steppe was over. Humans were backed into a corner, or more accurately, backed onto the remaining islands of dry land. And here is the brutal truth about forced migration. It compresses the population like sardines in a can. Before, if you met a group of strangers, you might wave a social hello and then go your separate ways. But now, there is nowhere left to go. The habitable world is shrinking every day. Groups of strangers, carrying different languages, different customs, are now forced to stare at each other by the same waterhole, fighting for the same hunting ground. They faced two classic choices of history: pick up a rock and smash the other guy's skull to take the last piece of meat, or grit your teeth, endure it, and cooperate. Of course, blood was spilled, lots of blood. But archaeology shows something stranger emerged from this chaotic swamp. For the first time, humans were forced to organize society on a scale larger than the family. They created tribes, they created laws, but to do that, they had to give up their most precious possession: freedom of movement. To cooperate, you have to stay in one place. You have to build relationships, establish hierarchy. The population concentration created by the floods threw humans into the first prisons built by themselves, permanent settlements. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when the trap snapped shut. When you are a nomad, you eat what you find that day. Why hoard when you have to carry it on your back for hundreds of kilometers? But when you are stuck in one place, you face a new fear: crop failure, winter, days of famine. You start having to store food. Sounds wise, right? But think carefully. What is a warehouse full of grain? It is a magnet for trouble. It attracts rats. It attracts lazy people. And most importantly, it attracts people with weapons who want to loot. For the first time in history, the concepts of mine and yours became intense. Some families hoarded more, they became rich. Others did not. Boom. Inequality was born. To protect that pile of food, you need walls. You need big burly guys standing guard. Welcome to the birth of the warrior class. You need the wisest or loudest guy to ration portions and give orders. Welcome to the birth of chiefs and kings. Look back. In just a few short generations, from free wanderers under the starry sky, we transformed into anxious guards, protecting food stores with our lives, bowing to rulers, and wielding weapons to kill our own kind over resources. That was the beginning of what we call civilization. And all this tragedy stemmed from the sea rising, herding us into cramped cages, forcing us to live together whether we wanted to or not. But that was just the opening act. Because just as humans thought they had stabilized life in these primitive concentration camps, another revolution hit. A green revolution, but watered with blood and sweat. Agriculture, but why then? Why right after the Great Flood? The answer lies beneath the mud you are stepping on. Look at this water. Chaotic, uncertain, and deadly. We often hear romantic stories about the origins of agriculture. That one fine day, our ancestors, wise sages, decided to put down their weapons, sow seeds of love, and live peacefully ever after. Sorry to burst your bubble, but that is a fairy tale for children. The reality is much crueler. Agriculture wasn't a great invention of intellect. It was a desperate survival response, right in the aftermath of the great floods. Remember the floods I talked about in the previous part. When the ice melted, giant lakes burst their banks. The sea rose. Rivers around the world began to behave like mad beasts, changing course constantly. But when the madness passed, they left behind a precious black gold: silt. Refugees fleeing the flooded coasts were driven into river valleys, and they realized something chillingly miraculous. Seeds that fell into the post-flood mud grew faster and stronger than anywhere else. You didn't need to plow with all your might. The river did the farming for you. It watered, it fertilized. Your job was just to scatter seeds and wait. Sounds like a gift from heaven, right? But in reality, humans signed a contract with the devil, because this only happened in very specific places: the Fertile Crescent, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River. It is no coincidence that all the first civilizations sprouted from these mud puddles. Post-flood geography forced humans to farm. And this is where everything changed forever. For the first time in the history of the species, a farmer could produce more food than he needed to eat. We call that surplus. And surplus is the father of stratification. Because there was extra food, some people didn't need to farm anymore. They were liberated to do other things: build temples, make pottery, forge weapons, and most importantly, figure out how to rule others. In just 5,000 years, a blink of an eye in geological history, we went from hunting groups of 20 people to super metropolises like Uruk with tens of thousands of citizens. We got writing, mathematics, standing armies, a big bang of culture. Archaeologists call it flowery names like the Neolithic Revolution. I call it a frantic sprint to escape extinction. But here is the craziest part few people tell you. All these brilliant civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, despite being thousands of miles apart, faced the same monster: water management. The rivers that gifted life were also serial killers. Flood too high, crops drown, villages swept out to sea. Flood too low, drought, famine, dry death. To survive, humans couldn't just sit and pray. They had to become engineers. Forget the pyramids or palaces. The first great works of humanity were dikes, canals, and sewers. The Mesopotamians dug canals to carry water miles away. The Egyptians invented the nilometer to measure the river level like measuring the heartbeat of death. The Indus people built underground drainage systems that even some modern cities today would envy. And to build those things, what do you need? You need to mobilize thousands of people working at the same time. You need someone to plan. You need someone to calculate the flow. You need someone to record who paid taxes and who didn't. The need to control floodwaters gave birth to government. The first bureaucracies weren't born to serve the people. They were born to manage water. The first kings were essentially CEOs of irrigation companies. If they controlled the water, society prospered. If they failed, civilization collapsed and vanished into archaeological dust. Natural selection was no longer working on individuals. It was working on the level of civilizations. But the price paid wasn't just sweat and freedom. Those floods left a deep scar in the human psyche. A psychological scar that we still carry to this day, camouflaged under mythological stories. Because this isn't just a story about water and mud. This is a story about memory, about terror passed down by word of mouth through thousands of dark nights around the fire. Your great-great-grandmother wasn't telling fairy tales for fun. She was warning you. And those warnings turned into the most haunting religions and legends on the planet. So we have reached the end of a story spanning 12,000 years, from a deadly frozen world to the warm and wet planet we are inheriting. But you know what keeps me awake at night? It isn't the past. It is the chilling similarity between them and us. What happened 12,000 years ago wasn't just a single event. It was the first domino falling, dragging an entire system down with it. Ice melted, dams broke, seas rose. 120 meters of water, the height of a 40-story building, submerged the continental shelves. The world map was redrawn, not by politicians, but by nature's fury. And through all that, humans still survived. We are the descendants of those survivors. You, me, all of us exist because our ancestors were masters of escape. They watched the world drown and found a way to live on at any cost. We are climate disaster survivors, literally. But, and this is a huge but, our ancestors had an advantage we don't have. A cheat code we have lost. Space. When the sea rose back then, they had places to go. The inland continents were mostly empty. Earth back then was like a vast mansion with only a few occupants. Lost your coastal home? No problem. Pack your backpack and head inland. And today, we have 8 billion people. We have national borders with armies guarding them. We have super metropolises worth trillions of dollars anchored in place. When the sea rises now, and believe me, it is rising while I am talking to you, where will we go? Bangladesh is losing land. Pacific Islands are planning to evacuate entire nations. Florida is flooding even when the sun is shining beautifully. Our ancestors faced climate change caused by natural cycles. We are facing climate change created by our own factory smokestacks. And the scariest difference is speed. Post-glacial flooding took place over thousands of years. A community had many generations to adapt, to relocate, slowly, gradually. But what we are seeing, it is happening in a single human lifetime. A child born today could witness sea levels rise to a level that took our ancestors dozens of generations to see. We are fast-forwarding the disaster movie. However, don't turn off the video and crawl under your bed to cry just yet. This ancient story also gives us a ray of hope, a reason for cautious optimism. It proves that humans are incredibly stubborn. Disaster didn't kill us. It transformed us. It kicked our butts out of the comfort zone and forced us to be creative. Rising seas forced us to invent boats, agriculture, and finally civilization. Pressure creates diamonds, and disaster creates social evolution. The question is, can we trigger that adaptive superpower once again? Can we face the current climate crisis with the resilience and creativity of our ancestors? Or will we drown along with our arrogance? And remember, we still don't know everything. Under 120 meters of water out there are torn chapters of human history, coastal civilizations that drowned, technologies that were lost, bloody lessons never told. What would those unfortunate coastal people think if they saw us today? Would they be proud of our skyscrapers? Or would they shake their heads in dismay because we are following in their footsteps, but at a speed many times faster? We will never know for sure. But their legacy lives on in us. In every legend of the Great Flood, in every city built by a river, and in the survivor genes flowing in your veins. The story is important not because it happened, but because it helps us understand who we are. We aren't the rulers of the earth. We are tenants, and the landlord, Mother Nature, is starting to get cranky again. Thank you for diving through these 12,000 years of dark and wet history with me. If you enjoyed this journey deep into ancient catastrophe, hit the like and subscribe buttons so I have the motivation to dig up more naked truths for you. And before you turn this off, leave a comment below to let me know. Where in the world are you listening to this story from? Are you living near a coast that used to be dry land, or in a valley that once lay beneath the waves? Look out the window and ask yourself, will the water come back? Good night. And remember, our ancestors survived a world that drowned. Their story lives in us. Don't let it end with this generation.